Have you ever wondered what it truly means to be chosen? Not for your appearance, not for your status, not even for your strength, but for something much deeper that others cannot see. Have you ever felt overlooked, underestimated, forgotten by those who should know you best? Have you ever stood before a challenge so massive, so overwhelming that everyone around you whispered it was impossible? Today, we journey into the extraordinary life of a man who experienced all of this and more. A man who rose from the dusty hills of Bethlehem to become Israel's greatest king. A man whose heart was so perfectly aligned with God's will that he was called a man after God's own heart. This is the story of David the shepherd boy who became a giant slayer, a fugitive who became a king, a sinner who became a saint, and a broken man who became a beacon of hope for all humanity. But David's story isn't just ancient history gathering dust on forgotten scrolls. It's a mirror reflecting our own struggles, our own dreams, our own potential for greatness that lies dormant within us. Because David's journey teaches us that God's greatest works often begin in the most unlikely places with the most unlikely people in the most impossible circumstances. It teaches us that the very things that make us feel small in the eyes of the world might be precisely what makes us precious in the eyes of God. In a world that celebrates the powerful and famous, that worships success and achievement, that measures worth by wealth and influence, David's story stands as a radical reminder that God's economy operates on entirely different principles. He chooses the weak to shame the strong, the foolish to shame the wise, the despised to bring to nothing the things that are highly esteemed. And if you've ever felt like you don't measure up, if you've ever wondered if your life matters, if you've ever questioned whether God could use someone like you, then David's story is your story too. Picture the rolling hills of Bethlehem, where the morning mist clings to olive groves, and the sound of bleating sheep echoes through limestone valleys. Here, in this small town that would one day be called the City of David, a boy named David spent his days in solitude with nothing but sheep for company. While his older brothers prepared for war and glory, dreaming of battlefield victories and royal commendations, David walked ancient paths with a shepherd's staff in his hand and songs of praise in his heart. To the world he was invisible, the youngest son of Jesse, too small to matter, too young to count, too insignificant to include in important family gatherings. His brothers were tall, strong, impressive to behold. Eliab, the eldest, carried himself with the confidence of a natural leader. Abinadab had the build of a warrior. Shammah possessed the sharp intelligence of a strategist. They looked like the kind of men who would make kings tremble and nations take notice. But David was just a shepherd boy with calloused hands and sun-withered skin, forgotten by his own family, overlooked even at his own dinner table. Yet in those seemingly insignificant years, something profound was happening. While David watched over sheep, God was watching over David. While the world saw only a boy playing with animals, heaven saw a future king learning the most important lessons of leadership. Because you cannot lead people until you learn to serve them, and you cannot serve people until you learn to love them. And David was learning to love in the purest way possible by laying down his life daily for creatures that could not defend themselves. Every morning, David would lead his flock to green pastures, knowing each sheep by name, understanding their individual personalities and needs. He knew which ones were prone to wander, which ones were weak and needed extra protection, which ones would follow faithfully, and which ones required constant watching. He learned that leadership isn't about commanding from a distance, but about walking alongside those entrusted to your decision. Knowing their struggles, understanding their fears, and being willing to sacrifice your own comfort for their welfare. When storms came, David didn't abandon his sheep to seek shelter. He stood guard through lightning and thunder, his cloak soaked with rain, his young body shivering with cold, because he understood that a true shepherd doesn't abandon his flock when conditions become difficult. When the sun blazed mercilessly overhead, David found shade for his sheep before seeking it for himself. When water was scarce, he made sure every sheep drank before he took a single sip. These weren't just acts of duty, they were acts of love. And they were shaping David's heart in ways that would make him a king unlike any other. But the wilderness held dangers that would test David in ways his family could never imagine. Lions prowled the rocky outcroppings, their golden eyes scanning for easy prey. Bears emerged from mountain caves, massive and hungry, seeing David's flock as a convenient meal. These weren't metaphorical challenges or spiritual exercises. These were life and death encounters that would determine whether David's sheep lived or died, whether his character would be forged in fire or shattered under pressure. The first time a lion attacked his flock, David could have run. He could have saved himself and explained to his father that wild animals were simply part of the cost of shepherding. No one would have blamed a young boy for fleeing in the face of a predator that could tear him apart with a single swipe of its claws. But something rose up within David that was stronger than fear, deeper than self-preservation. He couldn't bear the thought of one of his sheep being destroyed while he stood by, helplessly. With nothing but a wooden staff and a leather sling, David faced down that lion, not with reckless courage, but with a faith that had been growing quietly in his heart through countless hours of prayer and praise under starlit skies. He had learned that the God who painted sunsets and commanded the wind was also the God who could strengthen a shepherd boy's arm and guide a simple stone to find its mark. When that lion fell, David didn't boast to his brothers or seek recognition from his father. He simply thanked God buried the lion and continued caring for his sheep as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But God had seen. Heaven had witnessed. And the courage that defeated a lion in private would one day defeat a giant in public. Because God's greatest works are often rehearsed in secret before they're performed on the world stage. The battles you fight when no one is watching prepare you for the victories you'll win when everyone is looking. Each encounter with predators deepened David's faith and strengthened his resolve. He learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act in spite of fear. He discovered that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. That divine power flows most freely through human vessels that acknowledge their complete dependence on heaven's help. When bears threatened his flock, David didn't rely on his own might, but called upon the name of the Lord, and again God delivered both shepherd and sheep from certain destruction. These years of hidden training were also years of intimate worship. In the vast silence of the wilderness, with only sheep as his congregation and stars as his cathedral ceiling, David learned to commune with God in ways that most people never experience. He composed songs that poured from his heart like water from a spring, melodies that captured both the majesty of creation and the mercy of the Creator. The Psalms that would one day comfort millions of broken hearts were first sung to audiences of sheep under Middle Eastern skies. David learned that worship isn't just singing when you feel happy. It's choosing to praise God, even when wolves are howling in the darkness. He discovered that prayer isn't just asking for things, it's listening for the voice of the one who sees everything, including the hidden corners of your heart. In those May nights, when the only sounds were wind through olive trees and the gentle breathing of sleeping sheep, David found a peace that the world could not give and would never be able to take away. He sang of God's faithfulness when morning dew sparkled like diamonds on grass. He praised God's protection when he safely guided his flock through treacherous mountain passes. He worshiped God's provision when he found unexpected streams in dry places. And in those moments when loneliness pressed in and he wondered if anyone cared about a forgotten shepherd boy, he sang of God's love that never fails, never fades, never forgets even the smallest sparrow that falls. Those songs weren't performed for applause or recognition. They were the overflow of a heart that had discovered the secret of contentment, the joy of walking with God regardless of circumstances. David was learning that true worship has nothing to do with location or audience, and everything to do with the condition of your heart. Whether in a magnificent temple or a muddy field, whether surrounded by thousands or completely alone, the heart that truly knows God can't help but sing. The world still saw only a shepherd boy, but heaven was preparing a king. When King Saul's mental torment grew unbearable, and his servants searched throughout Israel for a musician skilled enough to bring peace to their troubled monarch, they found David. Here was this young man with dirt under his fingernails and the smell of the wilderness in his hair. Yet when he played his harp and lifted his voice in song, something supernatural happened. The darkness that tormented Saul lifted like morning fog before the sun. The evil spirits that had made the king's life a living hell fled at the sound of anointed worship. Peace filled the royal chambers like cool water in a desert place. Yet, even as David brought healing to the most powerful man in Israel, he remained unseen, unnoticed. Still, just a shepherd boy who could play music. He served in the palace by day and returned to his sheep by night, moving between two worlds without fully belonging to either. The servants saw him as a curious young musician. His family still saw him as the baby of the family, too young and inexperienced to be taken seriously. But God was weaving a story much larger than anyone could imagine, orchestrating events that would soon thrust this unknown shepherd boy onto the stage of history. Every skill David had learned, every battle he had fought, every song he had sung was preparing him for a moment that would change everything. The hands that had guided sheep would soon wield a king's scepter. The voice that had sung to God in solitude would soon address nations. The heart that had been broken by beauty and healed by worship would soon bear the weight of a crown. But first there was a giant to face. When the prophet Samuel arrived in Bethlehem with instructions from God to anoint Israel's next king, Jesse, proudly presented his sons one by one, certain that one of these impressive young men would be chosen for such an honor. First came Eliab, tall and commanding, with the bearing of a natural leader. Surely this was the one God had chosen. Samuel lifted his horn of oil, ready to pour it over Eliab's head. But Ahmad's voice whispered clearly in his heart, "Do not look at his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. One by one Samuel examined Jesse's sons. Abinadab passed before him, strong and capable, but God said no. Shammah stood tall and proud, but again God's voice was silent. 7 sons in total passed before the prophet, each one seemingly more qualified than the last, but none of them carried the heart that God was seeking. Samuel was confused. God had clearly told him that one of Jesse's sons would be Israel's next king, yet none of these impressive young men had been chosen. Finally, almost as an afterthought, almost embarrassed to admit it, Jesse mentioned that there was one more son, the youngest, but he was just a boy out tending sheep in the fields. Surely God wouldn't choose a child for such a momentous responsibility. But Samuel insisted that David be brought in, and Jesse reluctantly sent for his youngest son, expecting nothing more than to satisfy the prophet's strange request. Can you imagine David's surprise when he was suddenly called in from the fields, still smelling of sheep and wilderness, his hands dirty from morning chores, his hair tousled from the wind? He came running, probably wondering what trouble he might have caused or what emergency required his immediate presence. The last thing he expected was to find the great prophet Samuel waiting for him, along with all his brothers and his father, their faces a mixture of curiosity and confusion. But the moment Samuel saw David, God's voice rang clear and strong, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Without hesitation, Samuel took his horn of oil and poured it over David's head, declaring him the future king of Israel. Oil ran down David's face and soaked into his simple shepherd's garment, carrying with it the anointing of the Almighty God. In that moment, something powerful stirred within David's heart, something that would carry him through battles, betrayals, and the unimaginable weight of a crown. The boy who was overlooked by his own father was chosen by the Creator of the universe. The son who wasn't even invited to the family gathering was selected to lead an entire nation. The youngest, weakest, most insignificant member of Jesse's household was anointed to become Israel's greatest king. In God's economy, the last truly can be first, the least can become the greatest, and the forgotten can be chosen for purposes beyond their wildest dreams. But with anointing comes responsibility, and with calling comes preparation. David's real education was just beginning. The oil on his head was just the beginning of a process that would transform a shepherd boy into a monarch, but not through any ordinary means. God's preparation rarely looks like what we expect, and David's path to the throne would wind through valleys of testing that would either destroy him or forge him into the leader God intended him to be. Meanwhile, the Philistine army gathered for war, and with them came a champion whose very presence would strike terror into the hearts of Israel's bravest warriors. Goliath of Gath stood nearly 10 feet tall, a mountain of muscle and malice, covered in armor that weighed more than most men. His spear was like a weaver's beam, His shield was the size of a chariot wheel, and his voice carried across valleys like thunder from an approaching storm. For 40 days, morning and evening, this giant of a man had strutted between the two armies, hurling insults at Israel and blasphemous taunts at their God. His challenge was simple but terrifying. Send out a champion to fight him in single combat. Winner takes all. If he won, Israel would become slaves to the Philistines. If an Israelite could defeat him, the Philistines would serve Israel. It seemed like an easy proposition, except that no man in Israel was willing to face this monster. Seasoned warriors who had fought countless battles trembled at the sound of Goliath's voice. Trained soldiers who had never known fear hid in their tents rather than meet his gaze. The entire army of Israel men who had conquered cities and defeated enemies cowered before this one giant like children afraid of the dark. King Saul offered his own armor and weapons to anyone brave enough to face Goliath, along with marriage to his daughter and exemption from taxes for his family, but still no one stepped forward. The psychological warfare was devastating. Every morning and every evening, Goliath's taunts reminded Israel of their helplessness. His very presence was a declaration that their God was powerless, their army was weak, their nation was doomed. The giant wasn't just threatening military defeat. He was assault on their identity, their faith, their understanding of who they were as God's chosen people. Then David arrived at the battlefield carrying supplies for his brothers who were among the terrified soldiers. Jesse had sent him with bread and cheese, worried about his older sons who had been away at war for weeks. David came expecting to deliver food and return to his sheep. But when he heard Goliath's blasphemous taunts, when he saw God's people paralyzed by fear, something ignited within him that had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with spiritual reality. This wasn't just a challenge from one army to another. This wasn't simply a matter of military superiority or tactical advantage. This giant was mocking the living God, blaspheming the name of the one who had delivered Israel from Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had given them victory after victory against impossible odds. And David knew with the certainty that comes from years of trusting God in smaller battles that no giant could stand against the Almighty. David's brothers mocked him when he began asking questions about the giant and the king's offer of reward. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab demanded angrily. "And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the wickedness of your heart. You have come down to see the battle." Even his own family couldn't see past his youth to recognize the faith burning in his heart. They saw only a foolish boy seeking attention, not a future king responding to divine calling. But David couldn't be deterred by family criticism or popular opinion. When word of his interest reached King Saul, the desperate monarch summoned this young shepherd to hear what he had to say. Saul took one look at David and saw the impossibility of the situation even more clearly. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him," the king protested. "For you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." Then David spoke words that revealed the source of his confidence and the foundation of his faith. "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and struck him, and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. David wasn't boasting about his own strength or courage. He was testifying to God's faithfulness in past battles as evidence of what God would do in this present crisis. The lions and bears he had faced in private had been preparation for the giant he would face in public. Every victory in the wilderness had been building his faith for this moment when the eyes of two nations would be watching. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, David declared with unshakable confidence, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Wasn't presumption, it was faith. It wasn't foolishness. It was trust in a God who had proven himself faithful time and again in the secret places where only he and David knew what had really happened. King Saul, desperate for any solution to his impossible situation, finally agreed to let David face Goliath. He offered the young shepherd his own royal armor, his personal sword, his kingly weapons. But David knew that God's battles aren't won with man's equipment. He had faced lions and bears with nothing but faith and a sling, and God had delivered him. This would be no different. The armor was too heavy, the sword too cumbersome, the weapons too unfamiliar. David would trust in the tools he knew and the God who had blessed them. As David walked toward the valley where Goliath waited, he stopped at a brook and carefully selected 5 smooth stones, placing them in his shepherd's pouch. Not because he doubted that one stone would be enough, but because Goliath had 4 brothers, and David's faith was big enough to believe that God might want to use him to solve the entire giant problem that day. This wasn't confidence in his own accuracy with a sling. This was confidence in God's power to accomplish the impossible through the most unlikely means. The scene that unfolded next would be remembered for thousands of years as one of the greatest demonstrations of faith, overcoming fear of spiritual truth, trumping physical reality of God's power being perfected in human weakness. As David approached the giant, every eye on both sides of the battlefield was fixed on this incredible mismatch. A boy with a sling against a giant with a spear, youth against experience, faith against fear, the God of Israel against the gods of the Philistines. Goliath roared with laughter and rage when he saw David approaching. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the surrounding hills. "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." The giant's mockery was meant to paralyze David with terror, to make him turn and run like every other Israelite who had considered facing him. But David had learned something in those lonely years with the sheep that no one else in Israel understood. David called back his young voice, carrying across the valley with supernatural authority that silenced both armies. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Those words weren't just a response to Goliath's taunts. They were a declaration of faith that reached beyond the immediate battle to touch on eternal realities. David understood that this confrontation was about more than military victory or national pride. It was about the reputation of God Himself, about whether the God of Israel was truly the living God or just another tribal deity. The whole world was watching, and David was determined that they would see the power of the one true God displayed through the most unlikely instrument imaginable. Goliath charged forward, his massive frame thundering across the valley floor, his weapons gleaming in the morning sun, his war cry echoing like the roar of an earthquake. But David ran toward him, not away from him, closing the distance between them with the confidence of a shepherd who had learned that the closer you get to danger, the clearer you can see God's deliverance. He reached into his pouch, pulled out one smooth stone, placed it in his sling, and with a motion practiced thousands of times while protecting sheep from predators, sent that stone flying through the air with deadly accuracy. One smooth stone, one moment of trust, a perfect shot guided by the hand of Almighty God. The stone struck Goliath in the forehead with such force that it penetrated his skull and lodged in his brain. The giant who had terrorized an entire nation fell face first into the dust, defeated by a shepherd boy who knew that faith in God makes even the smallest person larger than any giant. The earth shook when Goliath hit the ground, and in that moment the entire balance of power shifted, not just between two armies, but between two worldviews. The Philistine army, which had seemed invincible just moments before, suddenly discovered that their champion was dead and their God was powerless. They fled in terror, abandoning their weapons and supplies in their desperate attempt to escape. Israel's warriors, who had been paralyzed by fear for 40 days, suddenly remembered their courage and pursued their enemies to victory, winning one of the most decisive battles in their nation's history. But the real victory wasn't military. It was spiritual. David had demonstrated before two nations that the God of Israel was indeed the living God, that faith in Him could overcome any obstacle, that His power was available to anyone willing to trust Him completely. The boy who had been forgotten by his family became the hero of a nation overnight. The shepherd, who had been invisible to the world, became the most famous person in Israel in a single moment. Yet heroism comes with a price that few people anticipate or understand. David's victory song was sung throughout Israel and beyond. Women danced in the streets chanting, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s." The shepherd boy had become more famous than the king, more celebrated than seasoned warriors, more beloved than men who had served their nation for decades. And King Saul's heart burned with jealousy that would eventually consume him. Success, David was about to learn, can be more dangerous than failure. When you're nobody, you have no enemies. When you're struggling, people feel sorry for you. When you're overlooked, others don't see you as a threat. But when God lifts you up, when He uses you in mighty ways, when your victories overshadow others' accomplishments, suddenly everyone is watching, measuring, comparing, and some are plotting your downfall. Saul's love for David turned to suspicion overnight. His gratitude became resentment. His admiration transformed into murderous jealousy. The same palace that had welcomed David as a musician now harbored him as a perceived threat. The king who had once found peace through David's worship now found torment in David's presence. What had started as a beautiful relationship between a troubled king and a gifted young man devolved into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The transformation in Saul was gradual at first, then sudden and violent. He began watching David with suspicious eyes, looking for signs of disloyalty or ambition. He started interpreting David's actions through the lens of paranoia rather than gratitude. When David played his harp to soothe the king's troubled spirit, Saul twice hurled his spear at the young man, trying to pin him to the wall. Only David's quick reflexes saved his life, and he began to understand that his presence in the palace was no longer welcome or safe. Saul's jealousy manifested in increasingly desperate attempts to eliminate David while maintaining plausible deniability. He offered David his daughter Merab in marriage, then gave her to another man. He promised David his daughter Michal, but only if David would bring him 100 Philistine foreskins as a bride price, hoping that David would be killed in the attempt. When David succeeded in this dangerous mission and returned with twice the required number, Saul's fear and hatred only intensified. The king began openly plotting David's death, issuing orders to his servants and even to his own son Jonathan to kill this young man who had saved Israel from their greatest enemy. But Jonathan loved David like a brother, and he warned him of his father's intentions. The two young men made a covenant of friendship that would last until death, a bond that transcended political intrigue and family loyalty. Jonathan, who was next in line for the throne, willingly protected the man he knew God had chosen to replace him. David found himself in an impossible situation. The man he had served faithfully, whose torment he had soothed with music, whose battles he had won with faith, now wanted him dead. The king who should have been his protector had become his persecutor. The palace that should have been his home had become his prison. David was forced to make a choice that would define the rest of his life: flee for his safety or stay and fight for his position. David chose to run, and with that choice, he entered the most difficult period of his young life. The boy who had been promised a kingdom now couldn't even claim a place to lay his head. The giant slayer who had been celebrated throughout Israel now lived as a fugitive in the very wilderness where he had once shepherded sheep. The anointed king of Israel hid in caves and strongholds, hunted like a common criminal by the man whose throne he was destined to inherit. In the cave of Adullam, David's first hideout, something remarkable began to happen. Men started coming to him, not the elite or the powerful, but the distressed, the discontented, and the debt-ridden. These were men who had been overlooked by society, forgotten by their families, rejected by the establishment. They were outlaws and outcasts, misfits and malcontents, people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by following a leader who understood what it meant to be rejected. 400 men gathered around David in that cave, and he found himself not just running for his life, but leading a band of unlikely followers who looked to him for hope, direction, and purpose. These weren't trained soldiers or noble knights. They were broken men seeking redemption, desperate men grasping for hope, forgotten men who saw in David someone who understood their pain because he shared their exile. David had to learn leadership not in a palace, surrounded by advisors and luxury, but in caves, surrounded by outcasts and danger. He had to inspire men not with the promise of wealth and position, but with the hope of redemption and purpose. He had to build loyalty not through rewards and privileges, but through shared hardship and mutual dependence. These were lessons that no royal academy could teach wisdom, that could only be gained through the crucible of adversity. As months turned into years, David's band grew from 400 to 600 men, all of them fiercely loyal to their leader, who had shown them dignity when society had given them only shame. They became a formidable fighting force, not because of their training or equipment, but because of their devotion to a man who valued them when no one else would. David was learning that true leadership isn't about commanding from a position of strength, but about serving from a place of vulnerability. During these wilderness years, David had multiple opportunities to end his suffering by taking matters into his own hands. Twice, circumstances placed King Saul completely at David's mercy. Once Saul entered the very cave where David and his men were hiding completely unaware of their presence. David's men whispered urgently that this was God delivering his enemy into his hands, that he should kill Saul and claim the throne that had been promised to him. But David crept up behind the king and cut off only a corner of his robe, even feeling guilty about that small act of disrespect. When Saul left the cave, David emerged and called out to him, holding up the piece of cloth as proof that he could have killed the king, but chose mercy instead. "See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand," David cried. "For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands." This scene reveals perhaps the most remarkable aspect of David's character. When you have the power to solve your problems, when justice seems delayed and mercy seems foolish, when everyone around you is urging you to take control of your destiny, the truest test of your heart is whether you'll wait on God's timing or force your own solution. David chose to wait. He chose to trust. He chose to honor the man who was trying to destroy him because he honored the God who had appointed that man as king. The second opportunity came when David and his nephew Abishai found Saul sleeping in his camp surrounded by his army, but completely vulnerable. Again, David's companion urged him to strike, offering to kill Saul himself with one thrust of his spear. Again, David refused, saying, "Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" Instead, he took Saul's spear and water jar as proof of his mercy, then called out from a distant hilltop to shame the king's guards for their carelessness in protecting their master. These incidents demonstrate something profound about David's understanding of God's sovereignty and his own role in God's plan. David had learned that God's promises are sure, but God's timing is perfect, and trying to fulfill God's promises through human effort rather than divine orchestration leads to disaster. He had learned that how you gain a throne matters as much as whether you gain it, that the means matter as much as the end, that character matters more than crown. The years of running, hiding, and waiting seemed endless. David watched his hair turn from black to gray in cave pools. He felt the weight of leading men who looked to him for hope, while his own heart sometimes grew weary with deferred dreams. He composed some of his most beautiful and heartbreaking psalms during this period, songs that captured both the agony of abandonment and the anchor of faith. "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" he wrote in Psalm 13. "How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" These weren't the words of a man whose faith never wavered, but of a human being wrestling with the gap between God's promises and present reality, between divine calling and current circumstances. Yet always David's songs ended in trust rather than despair, in hope rather than bitterness. "But I have trusted in your steadfast love." That same psalm continues, "My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." David was learning that faith isn't the absence of questions or struggles, but the decision to trust God's character, even when you can't understand his methods. Psalm 57, written when David was hiding from Saul in a cave, captures both the terror and the trust of those wilderness years. "Be merciful to me, O God. Be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge till the storms of destruction pass by." David had learned that sometimes God's protection doesn't remove you from the storm, but shelters you in the midst of it. During this period, David also learned hard lessons about leadership and the cost of making difficult decisions. When he and his men took refuge in the wilderness of Paran, they protected the flocks and shepherds of a wealthy man named Nabal, asking for nothing in return but expecting basic hospitality when they later requested provisions. Nabal not only refused their reasonable request, but insulted David and his men, calling them worthless rebels. David's anger flared, and he prepared to attack Nabal's household, intending to kill every male among them. It was Nabal's wise wife Abigail who intervened, bringing generous provisions and pleading with David not to stain his hands with unnecessary bloodshed. Her words stopped David from making a decision that would have haunted him for the rest of his life. "And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord taking vengeance himself." Abigail's wisdom reminded David that future kings must be careful about present actions, that the methods you use to solve problems today will determine the kind of leader you become tomorrow. David accepted her rebuke with humility, calling it a blessing from God that had prevented him from acting rashly. When Nabal died of natural causes shortly afterward, David married Abigail, gaining not just a wife, but a counselor whose wisdom would serve him well in the years to come. These wilderness years were also marked by the deepest friendship of David's life. His covenant relationship with Jonathan, Saul's son and heir to the throne. Despite the fact that David's rise meant Jonathan's displacement, despite the pressure from his father to eliminate this threat to their dynasty, Jonathan loved David with a love that transcended political calculation or personal ambition. The two young men met secretly to renew their covenant of friendship with Jonathan, acknowledging that David would be king and asking only that David show kindness to his family when that day came. "The Lord be with you as he has been with my father," Jonathan said willingly, surrendering his birthright to the man God had chosen. Their final meeting was heartbreaking, both men knowing they would likely never see each other again in this life. Jonathan's loyalty to David cost him his relationship with his father, and ultimately his life. When Saul discovered that his own son was protecting David, he flew into a rage, calling Jonathan a disgrace to his mother and hurling a spear at him just as he had done to David. "As long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established," Saul screamed at his son. "Now send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." But Jonathan stood firm in his loyalty to David, understanding that friendship based on truth is stronger than family ties based on jealousy. He knew that David was God's choice for Israel's throne, and he would not oppose God's will even to preserve his own inheritance. This kind of friendship, rare in any age, but especially in the cutthroat world of ancient politics, would become a model for sacrificial love that transcends self-interest. The pressure of being hunted, of living constantly in danger of leading men whose lives depended on his decisions, took its toll on David's soul. There were moments when the weight of God's calling seemed heavier than the promise of God's blessing. The gap between the anointing he had received as a boy and the throne he had been promised seemed as vast as the wilderness where he wandered. Some nights, lying on cold stone floors in dark caves, David must have wondered if Samuel had made a mistake, if God had changed his mind, if the oil poured on his head in Bethlehem had been nothing more than a beautiful dream. But it was in these moments of deepest doubt that David's faith proved its authenticity. Real faith isn't the absence of questions. It's the presence of trust in spite of questions. True faith doesn't mean you never feel abandoned. It means you continue to worship even when God feels distant. David's Psalms from this period reveal a man wrestling with God, arguing with God, pleading with God, but never abandoning God. In Psalm 142, written in a cave, David poured out his heart with raw honesty. "I cry out to the Lord with my voice. With my voice to the Lord I make my supplication. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare before him my trouble. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then you knew my path. In the way in which I walk, they have secretly set a snare for me. Look on my right hand and see, for there is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul." Yet, even in this psalm of desperation, David's conclusion reveals the anchor that held his soul steady in the storm. "I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully with me." This was David's secret. He had learned that God is enough. Not God plus a throne, not God plus recognition, not God plus the fulfillment of promises, but God alone. In the caves and wilderness places where everything else was stripped away, David discovered that his relationship with God was the one treasure that no enemy could steal, no circumstance could diminish, no delay could destroy. These years of exile also taught David profound lessons about the nature of power and the responsibility of leadership. Living among outcasts and outlaws, he learned that true authority comes not from position, but from character, not from what you can take, but from what you can give. His men followed him not because they had to, but because they wanted to, not because he forced their loyalty, but because he earned their love. David's band became a kind of alternative kingdom, a community of rejects who found purpose and dignity under his leadership. He showed them that their past failures didn't determine their future potential, that God could use broken people for beautiful purposes, that even outlaws could become heroes if they followed the right leader. In many ways, these men became David's greatest achievement, transformed from society's cast-offs into mighty warriors whose exploits would be remembered for generations. The years in the wilderness were also years of military education, though David didn't know it at the time. Leading a band of guerrilla fighters against superior forces, he learned tactics that would serve him well when he became king. He learned how to move quickly and quietly through difficult terrain, how to gather intelligence about enemy movements, how to strike hard and fast then disappear before counterattack could be organized. These weren't lessons taught in royal academies, but they were infinitely more valuable than anything he could have learned in a classroom. More importantly, David was learning spiritual warfare, understanding that every physical battle has a spiritual dimension, that victory comes not from superior numbers or weapons, but from alignment with God's will. He was learning to seek God's guidance before every major decision, to wait for divine timing, rather than rushing ahead with human plans, to give God glory for every victory rather than taking credit himself. As the years passed, David's reputation grew throughout Israel and beyond. Stories of his exploits spread from village to village, tales of his mercy towards Saul, his protection of the innocent, his leadership of the dispossessed. People began to see him not as a rebel or an outlaw, but as a righteous man, wrongly persecuted, a future king worthy of their hopes and dreams. The very persecution that was meant to destroy him was actually building his reputation and preparing the hearts of the people for his eventual reign. But God's timing is perfect, and the transition from outlaw to king would come only when David had learned every lesson the wilderness could teach, only when his character had been refined to the point where he could handle power without being corrupted by it, only when his heart had been broken and healed enough times that he could lead with both strength and tenderness. The end of David's exile came suddenly and tragically. News arrived that the Philistines had attacked Israel at Mount Gilboa, that King Saul and his army had been defeated, that Saul and 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, had died in the battle. The messenger who brought this news expected David to rejoice, even claiming that he himself had killed the wounded king to put him out of his misery. Instead, David's response revealed the transformation that had taken place in his heart during those years of testing. David could have celebrated. His enemy was dead. His path to the throne was clear. The man who had hunted him like an animal, who had driven him from his home and stolen years of his life, was finally gone. Instead, David tore his clothes and wept. He fasted until evening morning, not just for Jonathan, his beloved friend, but for Saul, the king who had tried to kill him. Then he composed a lament so beautiful, so full of grief and honor, that it moved an entire nation to tears. The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen, tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For the shield of the mighty is cast away there, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. David's lament for Saul and Jonathan revealed the heart that God had seen all those years ago in Bethlehem. This was not a man hungry for power or consumed with revenge. This was a man whose heart broke for his enemies, whose spirit grieved even for those who had wronged him. The shepherd's heart that had once protected sheep now mourned for the very wolf that had hunted him. This response to his greatest trial became the foundation for his greatest triumph, because it showed Israel and the world that their next king was a man whose strength was matched by his mercy, whose power was tempered by his compassion. The messenger who brought news of Saul's death, expecting reward for his supposed mercy killing of the king, instead found himself executed by David's order. How was it you were not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? David demanded. Even in Saul's death, David maintained the principle that had guided him through years of persecution, respect for God's appointed authority, even when that authority is misused. At 30 years old, David was finally ready to become king. The oil that Samuel had poured on his head in Bethlehem 20 years earlier was about to be vindicated, but not in the way anyone had expected. David's path to the throne hadn't been through palace intrigue or military conquest, but through caves and wilderness places, through rejection and exile, through the slow, painful process of character formation that can only happen in the crucible of adversity. The elders of Judah came to David first, anointing him king over the southern tribes. For 7.5 years, Israel remained divided, with David ruling from Hebron over Judah, while Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, claimed the throne over the northern tribes. This period of division was marked by intermittent civil war, a painful reminder that political unity cannot be achieved without spiritual unity, that lasting kingdoms cannot be built on force alone, but must be founded on genuine consensus and shared vision. During his reign in Hebron, David continued to demonstrate the wisdom and restraint that had characterized his wilderness years. When Abner, Saul's former general, came to negotiate the reunification of Israel under David's rule, David received him with honor, despite their history of conflict. When Joab, David's own general, murdered Abner in revenge for his brother's death, David publicly mourned and distanced himself from the act, ensuring that the blame for this treachery would not undermine the peace process. Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? David declared at Abner's funeral, his grief genuine and his political wisdom evident. He understood that building a united kingdom required not just military victory, but moral authority, not just the submission of enemies, but their genuine conversion to his cause. When Ishbosheth was assassinated by his own men who brought his head to David expecting reward, they met the same fate as the messenger who had claimed to kill Saul. David would not have his throne established through treachery, even treachery that benefited him. When wicked men have killed a righteous person in his own house on his bed, shall I not now require his blood at your hand and remove you from the earth? David demanded before ordering their execution. These acts of justice, costly though they were to David's immediate interests, established his reputation as a righteous king who valued honor above advantage, truth above expediency. They demonstrated that his years in the wilderness had not made him cynical or ruthless, but had refined his character to the point where he could handle power without being corrupted by it. Finally, representatives from all 12 tribes came to Hebron to anoint David as king over all Israel. Their words revealed how completely David's character had won their hearts. Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Also, in time past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel. Notice their language. They called him a shepherd, not a conqueror. They recognized that David's qualification for kingship wasn't his military prowess or political skill, but his heart to serve and protect God's people. The boy who had started as a literal shepherd of sheep was now acknowledged as the spiritual shepherd of a nation. David's first act as king of united Israel was to capture Jerusalem, a seemingly impossible task that demonstrated both his military genius and his spiritual insight. The Jebusites who controlled this mountain fortress were so confident in its impregnability that they taunted David, saying that even blind and lame people could defend it against his army. But David's men found a way into the city through its water system, and Jerusalem fell without a lengthy siege. More importantly, David recognized Jerusalem's strategic value not just as a military stronghold, but as a spiritual center. Located on the border between the northern and southern tribes, belonging fully to neither, it was the perfect place to establish a capital that could unite all Israel. David renamed it the City of David and began the process of transforming it from a Canaanite fortress into the holy city that would be the center of Jewish faith for thousands of years. But David's greatest achievement as king wasn't his military victories or political accomplishments, significant though they were. It was his recognition that true leadership begins with worship, that lasting kingdoms must be built on a foundation of reverence for God. One of his first priorities as king was to bring the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, home to Jerusalem where it belonged. The Ark had been captured by the Philistines decades earlier, then returned, but left in obscurity at Kiriath Jearim. David understood that a nation's spiritual center must be visible and accessible, that the people needed a tangible reminder of God's presence among them. The procession that brought the Ark to Jerusalem was one of the greatest celebrations in Israel's history, with David himself leading the worship with such abandon that he danced before the Lord with all his might. This scene, the king of Israel dancing in a linen ephod, worshiping with the common people, celebrating God's presence with uninhibited joy, captures the essence of David's kingship. This was not a monarch who saw himself as above his people or separate from their spiritual life. This was a king who understood that his greatest privilege was not ruling over God's people, but worshiping alongside them. David's wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, was embarrassed by her husband's public display of worship, criticizing him for what she saw as undignified behavior unbecoming of a king. But David's response revealed how completely his priorities had been transformed by his years of testing. "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will play music before the Lord, and I will be even more undignified than this, and will be humble in my own sight." David had learned that true dignity comes not from maintaining appearances, but from authentic relationship with God. That real authority flows not from distance and formality, but from humility and accessibility. He would rather be criticized by people for loving God too much than be praised by people for loving God too little. Under David's leadership, Israel experienced its golden age. He united the 12 tribes under one crown, one capital, and one vision. He expanded Israel's borders from the Euphrates River to the border of Egypt, fulfilling God's ancient promise to Abraham about the extent of the promised land. He defeated the Philistines, who had terrorized Israel for generations, conquered the Moabites and Edomites, who had been perpetual enemies, and established diplomatic relations with distant kingdoms, who sought alliance with this rising power. But David's military successes were matched by his domestic achievements. He established a system of justice that protected the weak and punished the wicked. He organized the priesthood and the temple service, creating a structure for worship that would last for centuries. He composed psalms that gave Israel a hymn book for every season of life, songs of praise for times of victory, laments for times of sorrow, confessions for times of sin, and declarations of trust for times of trouble. David also began planning for the temple that would replace the portable tabernacle, gathering materials and making preparations for the permanent house of worship that his son would build. Though God did not permit David to build the temple himself, calling him a man of war who had shed much blood, David threw himself into the planning with characteristic passion, understanding that this building would be his most lasting legacy. The temple plans that David drew up, inspired by divine revelation, were incredibly detailed and elaborate. He gathered tons of gold and silver, precious stones, and rare woods, organizing craftsmen and artists who would create a structure worthy of the God who had done so much for Israel. David understood that while God doesn't need a house to live in, his people need a place where they can encounter his presence in a special way. Perhaps most importantly, David established worship as the heartbeat of his kingdom. He organized choirs and orchestras, appointing thousands of Levites to serve in rotation, ensuring that praise and prayer would rise before God's throne 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He understood that a nation's spiritual health determines its ultimate destiny, that worship is not just something you do in addition to governance, but the foundation that makes righteous governance possible. David's Psalms became the prayer book of Israel, and eventually of the entire world. These weren't just religious poetry, but the authentic cries of a human heart wrestling with God through every conceivable circumstance. David wrote songs of triumphant praise when enemies were defeated, But he also wrote songs of desperate pleading when troubles seemed overwhelming. He composed hymns of grateful worship when God's blessings were abundant, but he also wrote laments of honest confusion when God's ways were mysterious. Psalm 23, perhaps the most beloved of all David's compositions, captures the heart of his relationship with God. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This psalm reveals how David's early years as a shepherd had shaped his understanding of God's character. Just as David had led his sheep to green pastures and still waters, protecting them from predators and guiding them through dangerous terrain, so God had led David through the wilderness years of his life, providing for his needs and protecting him from his enemies. The shepherd boy had become a king, but he never stopped seeing himself as a sheep in need of the great shepherd's care. But David was human, and his humanity showed in ways that nearly destroyed everything he had built. At the height of his power and success, when he should have been leading his armies in their annual campaign against the Ammonites, David chose to stay home in Jerusalem. It was spring, the time when kings go out to battle, but David sent Joab and his men while he remained in comfort and luxury. This decision to absent himself from his duty marked the beginning of David's greatest trial and most devastating failure. Walking on his palace roof one evening, David saw a woman bathing, and he was overcome with desire for her. Her name was Bathsheba, and she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's own mighty men, who was away fighting David's battles while David indulged his appetites. David could have turned away. He could have recognized the temptation and fled from it as he had fled from Saul. He could have remembered his own psalms about the blessedness of the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. Instead, he used his kingly power to summon Bathsheba to his palace, and what happened next would stain his reign and haunt his family for generations. The man who had shown mercy to his enemies showed no mercy to a faithful soldier. The king who had refused to take another man's life, even when that man was trying to kill him, now arranged for a loyal warrior to be murdered simply to cover his own sin. When Bathsheba became pregnant, David first tried to trick Uriah into sleeping with his wife so the child could be passed off as Uriah's. When that failed, because of Uriah's integrity and devotion to duty, David ordered Joab to place Uriah in the forefront of the fiercest battle and then withdraw from him so that he would be killed. The man after God's own heart had committed adultery and murder. The shepherd who had protected the innocent had destroyed the innocent. The king who had established justice throughout his realm had perverted justice for his own convenience. David's sin was devastating, not just because of what he did, but because of who he was. When shepherds become wolves, when protectors become predators, when those called to uphold righteousness become agents of wickedness, the damage goes far beyond individual lives to shake the very foundations of society. Uriah died as David had planned, falling in battle while fighting for a king who had already stolen his wife and was now stealing his life. When the messenger brought news of the military casualties, including Uriah's death, David responded with callous indifference, "Do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as another." David then married Bathsheba, making her death-bought pregnancy appear legitimate, and for a time it seemed as though his plan had worked. No one suspected the king of adultery or murder. No investigation was launched. No charges were brought. David had used his power to commit the perfect crime, and he appeared to have gotten away with it completely. But there is one who sees in secret, who knows every thought and motive, who cannot be deceived by human cleverness or intimidated by earthly power. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Scripture records and those simple words carry the weight of divine judgment that no human authority can escape. For nearly a year, David lived in denial, pretending nothing had happened, carrying on with royal duties while his soul withered within him. He continued to lead worship services and compose psalms, but the songs lacked the authenticity that had characterized his earlier work. He maintained the appearance of righteousness, while his heart grew cold and hard. Later, he would describe this time in Psalm 32, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me, my strength was sapped, as in the heat of summer." Success without integrity is a prison. Power without purity is poison. And David was slowly dying under the weight of his hidden sin, discovering that the crown cannot protect you from the consequences of a guilty conscience, that no amount of public acclaim can silence the voice of private condemnation. Then came Nathan the prophet with a story that would shatter David's world and save his soul. Nathan told of a rich man who had many flocks and herds, but stole a poor man's one beloved lamb to feed a guest, rather than taking from his own abundance. David's righteous anger flared as it had when he first heard Goliath's blasphemous taunts. "As the Lord lives," David declared, "the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore fourfold for the lamb, because he did this thing and because he had no pity." Then Nathan looked the king directly in the eye and spoke 4 words that changed everything. "You are the man." The parable wasn't just a story, it was a mirror. And David suddenly saw himself as God saw him, as others saw him, as history would remember him. The rich king with many wives had stolen the one wife of a poor soldier. The powerful monarch who lacked nothing had taken everything from a man who had given everything in his service. In that moment, David faced the greatest battle of his life, not against a giant with a spear, but against his own pride, his own position, his own carefully constructed public image. He could have had Nathan killed for his insolence. He could have denied everything and demanded proof. He could have used his royal power to silence the accusation and cover the scandal. Instead, he did something that revealed why God had chosen him in the first place, something that showed the heart that had been hidden under layers of compromise and self-deception. David broke. Completely, utterly, devastatingly broke. No excuses, no justifications, no attempts to minimize his guilt or spread the blame, just 5 words that saved his kingdom and restored his soul. "I have sinned against the Lord." The man who had conquered cities was conquered by conviction. The king who had defeated armies was defeated by truth. The monarch who commanded thousands bowed before the authority of divine justice and acknowledged his guilt without reservation or qualification. It was the most powerful moment of David's entire reign, not because it demonstrated his strength, but because it revealed his brokenness. Nathan's response was immediate and merciful. "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die." But forgiveness doesn't eliminate consequences. And David would learn that while God's grace covers sin, it doesn't necessarily prevent the natural results of wrong choices from playing out in painful detail. David wrote Psalm 1 during this time of confession and repentance, and it became the prayer of every broken heart for thousands of years to come. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness. According to the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight." This psalm reveals David's complete understanding of the spiritual dimensions of his failure. He recognized that while he had wronged Bathsheba and Uriah, his ultimate offense was against God, whose law he had violated and whose character he had misrepresented. He didn't ask for a lighter punishment or special consideration because of his position. He simply threw himself on the mercy of the God he had betrayed. "Create in me a clean heart, O God," David pleaded, "and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me by your generous spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners shall be converted to you." The consequences of David's sin began immediately and rippled through his family and kingdom for the rest of his life. The baby born from his relationship with Bathsheba became ill and died despite David's desperate fasting and prayer. David's response to this tragedy revealed how completely his repentance had transformed his perspective. While the child lived, David fasted and wept and pleaded with God for mercy. When the child died, David rose, washed himself, worshiped God, and accepted the divine judgment with submission. "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept," David explained to his confused servants, "for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." This response demonstrated David's mature understanding of God's sovereignty and the proper response to divine discipline. He had learned that genuine repentance includes accepting the consequences of sin without bitterness or resentment, trusting that God's judgments are always righteous, even when they are painful. But the consequences of David's sin extended far beyond his own life. Nathan had prophesied that because David had given occasion for the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the sword would never depart from his house. This wasn't vindictive punishment, but the natural result of a leader's failure, the way sin in high places creates chaos in low places, the inevitable consequence of broken trust and compromised authority. David's own children, having seen their father's moral failure, began to follow patterns of deception and violence that would tear the royal family apart. His son Amnon raped his half-sister, Tamar, David's daughter, in a crime that eerily paralleled David's own abuse of power for sexual gratification. When David failed to properly punish Amnon for this atrocity, another son, Absalom, took justice into his own hands and murdered his brother. Absalom then fled into exile, and David found himself reliving his own wilderness years as he mourned for both sons, the dead son who had committed rape and the living son who had committed murder. The king who had shown mercy to his enemies struggled to know how to balance justice and love within his own family, how to be both a righteous king and a loving father. When Absalom finally returned to Jerusalem after 3 years of exile, his relationship with David remained strained and complicated. David's own guilt over his past failures made it difficult for him to address his children's present failures with the moral authority that effective parenting requires. The man who had conquered nations found himself unable to control his own household. The king who had united a kingdom watched his own family disintegrate. Absalom was handsome, charismatic, and ambitious, with his father's political gifts but without his father's heart for God. He began undermining David's authority by positioning himself as a more accessible and sympathetic alternative to the aging king. "If only I were made judge in the land," Absalom would say to those seeking justice. "Then everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me, and I would give him justice." This political maneuvering went on for years, with Absalom slowly stealing the hearts of the people, while David, blinded by paternal love and perhaps guilt, failed to recognize the threat his own son posed to his kingdom. When Absalom finally declared himself king in Hebron, David was caught completely off guard, forced to flee Jerusalem in the middle of the night to avoid capture. The scene of David's flight from Jerusalem was one of the most heartbreaking in his entire life. The king who had entered the city in triumph 30 years earlier now left it in shame and sorrow, barefoot and weeping, his head covered in mourning, accompanied by loyal followers who wept with him. The man who had danced before the ark with joy now walked away from the ark in anguish, not knowing if he would ever see the holy city again. As David climbed the Mount of Olives, fleeing from his own son, a man named Shimei from Saul's family came out and cursed him, throwing stones and dust while shouting, come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue! The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom your son. So now you are caught in your own evil, because you are a bloodthirsty man." David's nephew Abishai wanted to kill Shimei for this insolence, but David restrained him with words that revealed how his understanding of God's sovereignty had deepened through suffering. "Let him alone, and let him curse, for so the Lord has ordered him. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day." This response showed how completely David had internalized the lessons of his own failure and repentance. He understood that his current suffering might be part of God's discipline for past sin, that accepting unjust criticism with patience might be part of his path back to full restoration. The king, who could have commanded armies to defend his honor, chose instead to humble himself under God's mighty hand, trusting that divine vindication would come in God's timing. The civil war that followed was brief but devastating. Absalom's rebellion attracted thousands of followers who had grievances against David's administration, or who simply thought it was time for new leadership. Battle lines were drawn between father and son, between old loyalty and new ambition, between the established order and revolutionary change. David's forces, led by experienced commanders like Joab, proved superior to Absalom's hastily assembled army. But David's instructions to his generals revealed his torn heart. "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." Even in the midst of a war for his kingdom, David's paternal love trumped his royal duty. He would rather lose his throne than lose his son. The battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim, where Absalom's forces were routed by David's experienced warriors. As Absalom fled on his mule, his famous long hair caught in the branches of an oak tree, leaving him hanging helplessly while his mount continued running. Joab found him there, and despite David's specific orders, killed him with 3 spears through his heart. When news of Absalom's death reached David, his reaction revealed the depth of a father's love and the cost of a king's choices. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, O Absalom. My son, my son." David's grief was so overwhelming that it threatened to turn military victory into political disaster, as his mourning suggested he cared more about his rebellious son than about the loyal soldiers who had risked their lives to restore him to the throne. Joab had to rebuke the king harshly. "Today you have disgraced all your men who this day have saved your life, the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives, and the lives of your concubines, in that you love your enemies and hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, then it would have pleased you well." This rebuke, though harsh, was necessary to shock David back to his royal responsibilities. Personal grief, no matter how legitimate, cannot be allowed to compromise public duty. A king's private sorrows cannot overshadow his public obligations to those who serve him faithfully. David eventually composed himself and returned to the business of reuniting and rebuilding his kingdom, but the scars of this family tragedy would never fully heal. The rebellion's aftermath required all of David's political wisdom and personal restraint. He had to forgive those who had supported Absalom without appearing weak to those who had remained loyal. He had to rebuild trust with tribal leaders who had questioned his leadership without compromising the principles that had made his reign successful. He had to balance justice and mercy in ways that would satisfy competing demands for both accountability and reconciliation. David's handling of this delicate situation revealed the political maturity he had gained through decades of leadership. He pardoned former enemies like Shimei, who asked for forgiveness, restored property to those who had been displaced by the conflict, and reorganized his administration to address the legitimate grievances that had made Absalom's rebellion possible in the first place. But perhaps most importantly, David used this crisis as an opportunity for spiritual reflection and renewal. He composed several psalms during this period that showed his deepened understanding of God's ways and his own need for divine grace. Psalm 3, written when he fled from Absalom, captures both his confidence in God's protection and his acceptance of God's discipline. Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. The years following Absalom's rebellion were marked by David's gradual transition from active ruler to elder statesman. He continued to reign effectively, but he began preparing for the succession that would transfer power to the next generation. This process was complicated by the fact that he had multiple sons with legitimate claims to the throne, and by his own failure to clearly designate his chosen heir. Until late in his reign, Adonijah, one of David's older surviving sons, attempted to claim the throne before David's death, gathering support from some of the king's longtime advisors, including Joab and Abiathar the priest. This premature move forced David to act quickly to secure the succession for Solomon, the son he had chosen, in consultation with the prophet Nathan and his wife Bathsheba. The choice of Solomon was controversial in some circles because he was relatively young and was not the eldest surviving son. But David had learned through painful experience that the most obvious choice is not always God's choice, that divine selection often defies human expectations. Solomon possessed wisdom beyond his years and a heart for God that reminded David of his own youth qualities that mattered more than age or birth order in determining fitness for kingship. David's final years were devoted to preparing Solomon for the enormous responsibility of ruling Israel and building the temple that had been David's own greatest dream. He passed on not just the crown and the kingdom, but the spiritual legacy that would enable Solomon to succeed where others might fail. His final words to his son revealed the hard-won wisdom of a lifetime spent learning to lead God's people. I go the way of all the earth, David told Solomon on his deathbed. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. This charge reveals David's understanding that successful leadership flows from successful discipleship, that political authority must be grounded in spiritual submission, that the secret of reigning well is learning first to serve well. The lessons David had learned as a shepherd boy, refined in the wilderness, tested in the palace, and deepened through failure and forgiveness, were now being passed to the next generation. David also gave Solomon practical advice about dealing with specific individuals who had served or opposed his reign. Some were to be rewarded for their loyalty. Others were to be watched carefully because of their past treachery. This wasn't vindictiveness, but wisdom, recognizing that a new king needs to understand the character and history of those around him in order to build a stable administration. But perhaps most importantly, David shared with Solomon the plans for the temple that had consumed his thoughts and prayers for decades. These weren't just architectural drawings, but a vision of what Israel could become when God's presence dwelt fully among his people. David had gathered enormous quantities of gold, silver, bronze, and precious stones for this project, but he understood that the real foundation of the temple would be spiritual, not material. And you, Solomon, my son, David, said in his final public address, know the God of your father and serve him with a loyal heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. These words captured the essence of David's spiritual legacy. He had learned through triumph and tragedy that success in God's kingdom depends not on human strength or wisdom, but on wholehearted devotion to the Lord. The temple would be magnificent, but it would only be as meaningful as the heart of the king who built it and the people who worshiped there. David's vast recorded words, preserved in 2 Samuel 23, reveal a man who had learned to see his life and reign in eternal perspective. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spoke to me, he who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. And he shall be like the light of the morning, when the sun rises a morning without clouds, like the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. This poetic vision describes not just good government, but godly leadership, the kind of rule that brings hope and healing rather than oppression and despair. David understood that leaders are meant to be like morning light, dispelling darkness and bringing clarity like rain that causes new growth and fresh beginnings. He had tried to embody this kind of leadership throughout his reign, and he was passing this vision on to his successor. When David died at the age of 70, Israel mourned not just a king, but a poet, a warrior, a worshiper, and a man who had shown them what it looks like to walk with God through every season of life. His reign of 40 years, 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem, had transformed Israel from a collection of loosely affiliated tribes into a unified nation that commanded respect throughout the ancient world. But David's political achievements, significant though they were, paled in comparison to his spiritual legacy. His Psalms became the prayer book of the world, giving voice to every human emotion and experience in language that connects earth to heaven. His life became a template for authentic spirituality that doesn't deny human weakness, but finds strength in divine grace. More than anything else, David demonstrated that God's greatest works are accomplished not through perfect people, but through people who perfect their relationship with God through honest wrestling, genuine repentance, and wholehearted worship. He showed that true greatness is measured not by the absence of failure, but by the response to failure, not by never falling, but by always getting back up. David's story reveals God's incredible patience with human weakness and his amazing ability to use broken people for beautiful purposes. The shepherd boy who was overlooked by his family became the king who was remembered by history. The giant slayer who trusted God in his youth became the psalmist who sang of God's faithfulness in his old age. The sinner who fell spectacularly became the saint who repented completely. Perhaps, most importantly, David's life points forward to something greater than himself. The promises God made to David about his dynasty, about a descendant who would reign forever, about a kingdom that would have no end, were only partially fulfilled in Solomon and the kings who followed. The complete fulfillment would come 1,000 years later in the same city of Bethlehem, where David had been born. Jesus of Nazareth, the ultimate son of David, would face his own giant in the form of sin and death. But unlike David's victory over Goliath, which was temporary and limited, Jesus' victory would be eternal and universal. He would defeat the ultimate enemy, not with a stone from a sling, but with his life on a cross. He would establish a kingdom not built on military might or political power, but on love, grace, and sacrificial service. In Jesus, we see the David that could have been, the perfect king, who never sinned, never fell, never needed forgiveness, because he was forgiveness incarnate. Yet Jesus honored David, called himself the Son of David, and showed us that God's greatest works still begin in the most unlikely places with the most unlikely people. David's heart cry in Psalm 27 became the heart cry of everyone who would follow in his footsteps of faith. One thing I have desired of the Lord, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. This wasn't just the wish of an ancient king, but the deepest longing of every human heart. To know God intimately, to see his beauty clearly, to understand his ways perfectly. The temple that Solomon built, according to David's plans, was magnificent, but it was only a shadow of the true temple that Jesus would establish, not a building made with hands, but a spiritual house built of living stones, believers from every nation and tribe and tongue who would worship God in spirit and in truth. David's story speaks to every heart that has ever felt small, overlooked, forgotten. It whispers hope to everyone who has ever faced a giant that seemed too big to overcome. It offers grace to all who have fallen, failed, and wondered if God could ever use them again. Because David's life teaches us that God doesn't choose the qualified, he qualifies the chosen. He doesn't use perfect people, he perfects the people he uses. The boy who was forgotten by his father was remembered by God. The shepherd who was overlooked by his brothers was chosen by heaven. The young man who was hunted by a king became a king himself. The sinner who fell into adultery and murder found forgiveness and restoration. The broken man who mourned his failures became a beacon of hope for all who struggle with their own weaknesses. David shows us that true greatness isn't measured by the size of your achievements or the extent of your influence, but by the condition of your heart before God. That worship matters more than warfare, that character counts more than conquest, that a broken heart seeking God is worth more than all the victories and crowns this world can offer. In our age of social media and instant fame, when everyone wants to be seen and celebrated, David reminds us that our most important audience is an audience of one. That the songs we sing in private, the prayers we pray in secret, the character we build when nobody's watching, these matter more than all the public applause we could ever receive. When you feel small in the face of a giant challenge, remember the shepherd boy with a sling. When you feel overlooked and undervalued, remember that God sees what others miss. When you feel like your preparation time is being wasted, remember that God's university often meets in wilderness places. When you face the consequences of your own failures, remember that God's grace is greater than your greatest mistake. David's life teaches us that every giant can fall when faced with faith, that every wilderness season has a purpose, that every broken heart can still worship, that every failure can become a testimony of God's redeeming love. His story reminds us that the heart that God chooses is not the heart that never falls, but the heart that gets back up, seeks forgiveness, and continues to pursue God with passionate, humble devotion. The shepherd boy became a king, but more importantly, he became a man after God's own heart. And that same God who chose David is still choosing unlikely people today, still using the small things to accomplish great things, still looking not at outward appearance, but at the condition of the heart. In a world that celebrates the powerful and famous, remember the shepherd boy from Bethlehem. In an age that worships success and achievement, remember the heart that mattered more than the crown. And when you feel forgotten, overlooked, or ordinary, remember that God's greatest stories often begin with the most unexpected heroes. Your giant may be different from David's, but your God is the same. Your wilderness may look different from his caves, but your preparation has the same purpose. Your failures may feel unique to you, but your Redeemer offers the same grace. And your calling may seem impossible to others, but you serve the same God who makes streams in the desert, who brings beauty from ashes, and who still uses shepherd boys to change the world. The question isn't whether you're qualified for God's calling on your life. The question is whether your heart is open to His voice, available for His purpose, and willing to trust His timing, even when it doesn't make sense to anyone else. The question is whether you'll worship in the wilderness while waiting for the palace, whether you'll serve faithfully in small things while preparing for great things, whether you'll trust God's character when you can't understand His methods. David's legacy lives on in everyone who chooses to trust God's voice over the crowd's opinion, who worships in the darkness while waiting for the dawn, who faces giants with faith instead of fear, and who remembers that true greatness is found not in being served, but in serving, not in being exalted, but in lifting others up to see the glory of the one who chooses the unlikely, loves the broken, and uses the willing to write stories that echo through eternity. This is the legacy of David, the shepherd, the giant slayer, the king, the psalmist, the sinner, the saint, and ultimately the man after God's own heart, whose story reminds us that no matter who you are or where you've been, God has a purpose for your life that is greater than your greatest dream and more beautiful than your wildest imagination. The heart of David beats on in everyone who dares to believe that God's love is unconditional. His grace is sufficient, His power is unlimited, and His plans are perfect. It beats on in everyone who understands that being chosen by God isn't about being perfect, but about being available, not about having all the answers, but about trusting the one who does not, about never falling, but about always getting back up. From the hills of Bethlehem to the throne of Jerusalem, from the caves of exile to the palace of power, from the depths of failure to the heights of forgiveness, David's journey teaches us that God's grace is always greater than our guilt. His love is always stronger than our weakness, and His purposes are always bigger than our problems. The shepherd boy who became Israel's greatest king shows us that with God, all things are possible, that no dream is too big, no past too broken, no future too uncertain for the one who sees the end from the beginning and works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. This is the story of David, but it's also your story, because the same God who chose a shepherd boy to become a king is still choosing ordinary people to do extraordinary things. The same God who saw David's heart is looking at your heart right now. The same God who had a plan for David's life has a plan for your life too. And that plan is more wonderful than you could ever imagine, because it's written by the hand of the one who created you, who knows you, who loves you, and who has been preparing you for this moment when you would hear David's story and realize that it's really an invitation to trust, to hope, to believe, and to step into the adventure of a lifetime with the God who specializes in using the unlikely to accomplish the impossible. The heart of David beats on, and it beats in you.